Good morning, everyone. We are delighted to have each and every one of you with us today, and we are looking forward to this morning with great anticipation. I'm Jonathan Wells. I'm the managing publisher of the Christian Science Monitor. At the Christian Science Monitor, we are all about shining light on human progress and on new insights and models of thought that generate that progress. One area that needs progress most is the frontier of energy and climate. For the last year, Monitor energy coverage has brought our signature blend of journalistic rigor and humanity to one of climate's major storylines, the upcoming Paris negotiations. So far, we've had interesting conversations with Adam Szymanski of the EIA and Gina McCarthy of the EPA. Now, we're just a few weeks from Paris. Today, we'll hear from someone who knows the dynamics of heading into the talks better than almost anyone, Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome, Secretary Figueres. We're also pleased to be here with the support of the Nuclear Energy Institute, our sponsor for this morning's conversation. We look forward to hearing from one of their colleagues in just a few moments. The Monitor is dedicated to convening constructive conversations. We want to get into tough issues and have respectful discussions about how to move forward. We look forward to doing just that today. With that, let me turn it over to one of my esteemed colleagues. He is the Assistant Director of Content Strategy at the Monitor, and frankly, he helps make all of this happen, Mr. David Grant.
Yes, sir. So Jonathan does the poetry and I do the prose. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We'd like to thank NEI again for all their support making this morning possible. They've just been a wonderful partner to us, and we really appreciate all that they do. You can tweet this morning to the hashtag CSMParis or Nuclear4Climate. And thank you so much again for being with us. To get the show started this morning, we'll begin with a presentation from Eileen Clausen. After stints at the EPA and the National Security Council, Eileen has most recently served the nation as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, and then as President and founder of the Center for Climate Energy Solutions. She came to Washington, to George Washington University, hoping to be Secretary of State, and got a lot farther than the rest of us who came to Washington hoping to be Secretary of State at George Washington University, and went on to get a master's degree from the University of Virginia, which I'm obliged to tell you is a very fine university in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that's coming from someone who went to Virginia Tech. So please join me in welcoming Eileen Clausen.
Will there be a global agreement to address climate change in Paris this year? I'm confident the answer is yes. There are still some difficult remaining issues, and I'm sure Christiana will discuss those. But 155 countries have already submitted pledges to constrain or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. These commitments vary in type and ambition, but together they represent 86% of global emissions and 88% of global population. Procedures like reporting will be binding. Targets or commitments will not be, they'll be voluntary. But, and I think this is quite important, the agreement and the targets will be reviewed every few years with the explicit purpose of seeing where countries stand with respect to their pledges and establishing what the next steps will be. So the obvious next question is, will the agreement be a good one that points us toward the goal that all countries have agreed upon, limiting temperature to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels? The answer is really twofold. I would say that the agreement is good in that most countries, developed and developing, are making commitments, and that's a first. And it's really taken since the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's 23 years ago, to reach this point. But the agreement is not so good because it puts us on a path that is closer to a 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100 rather than a 2-degree increase. And that assumes all countries actually meet the targets they have set, which is certainly not a given. So let's look at these pledges for just a moment. I mean, the most ambitious is the EU. They pledged to keep their emissions at 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Then there's a group of countries that in my day in negotiating, we called the juice cans countries. I don't know if we still do, but Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who have targets roughly 25 to 28% below 2005 levels by either 2025 or 2030. China agreed to peak emissions by 2030, but before you get too excited by this, it means that China's emissions will continue to increase for the next 15 years. And India has a carbon intensity target of 33 to 35% below 2005 levels. That's emissions per unit of GDP. So India's emissions will continue to grow in absolute terms as well for the next 15 years. Let's just take a deeper dive into the US target. It's based on existing legislation, with a large portion of the decrease based on the just issued clean power regulations. It assumes the rules survive, and I think that's a fair bet, even though they're already being litigated. Each state has its own target developed by EPA and must decide how to meet the target. EPA has to approve the plan, and if not satisfactory, can require compliance with a federal plan to meet the target emission level that's provided to the state. Compliance with the approved plans begins in 2022. It's similar to the international regime in that each country, or in this case, each state, has to figure out how to meet their target. And this brings me to the other significant shortcoming that I see in the international regime that is also relevant for the US program. First, we need to keep in mind that when you add up the Paris commitments, greenhouse gas emissions would still be increasing in 2030. What this really means is that actions taken over the next 10 to 15 years must not only reduce as much as possible in the short term, but must also sow the seeds for steep cuts post-2030. When countries submitted their commitments, they provided some discussion on how those commitments would be met. The focus of much of the discussion in the submissions was on energy efficiency and renewables. And clearly, both have to be a part of any program for any country, and for that matter, for the United States as a whole, and for every state in the United States. Certainly, energy efficiency is a no-brainer. It saves energy and the pollution associated with that energy, and it saves money. It's a terrific short-term approach to reducing emissions. Renewables, meanwhile, have come down sharply in price and are growing at a very rapid rate, although off a very small base. Still, increased deployment of renewables is key for all countries and all states, both in the short term and the long term. For renewables, additional progress in storage and transmission technologies is also necessary. But as I indicated, global emissions will clearly not be where they need to be in 10 to 15 years. And while we will not be able to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, we also don't have to end up with a 3-degree or a 4-degree increase. So while moving as quickly as possible is important, having a plan that deals with the mid and longer term is also critical. A sound longer-term plan, in my view, must include efficiency improvements and increased use of wind and solar power. But it also has to include 3 additional important components. First, as we begin to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, we need to make sure that we have reliable baseload power, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, everywhere in the world. At the moment, coal, gas, and nuclear supply most of our baseload power. But coal is the leading source of greenhouse gases worldwide, and while natural gas is cleaner than coal, it's still a fossil fuel, and its combustion still produces greenhouse gases. The bottom line is that nuclear is currently the only 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week source of power that does not result in the emission of greenhouse gases. It's hard for me to believe that we can limit temperature increases and their associated impacts without vastly expanded use of nuclear power. At the moment, fossil fuels dominate as a source of electricity, representing approximately 68% globally. Nuclear currently accounts for around 11 or 12%, hydro for around 15%, with solar, wind, and geothermal accounting for much of the remaining 5 or 6%. Under a business as usual scenario, nuclear power could decrease to less than 10% by 2035. On the other hand, the International Energy Agency says that nuclear would have to grow to at least 18% if we're going to come close to meeting our global targets by 2050. So increased use of nuclear power should be a key consideration in both the development and implementation of global commitments and the development and implementation of state clean power plans. Second, some form of carbon capture and storage or reuse will also be essential. Even if coal use declines in the developed world, as is now the trend, coal-fired power plants continue to be built in the developing world. Yes, many are more efficient than the majority in use today, but these plants can be operated for 50 years or more. In the developed world, these plants are often replaced by natural gas plants, which are also greenhouse gas sources. To the extent that they can be replaced by nuclear, wind, or solar, the climate benefits would, of course, be far greater. But because coal use continues to grow in the developing world, and natural gas use is growing in the United States and elsewhere, emissions are going to continue their upward trend even under the Paris Agreement commitments. As a result, carbon capture and storage or reuse should also be a part of the plans and programs of those countries and states that are and will remain dependent on fossil fuel combustion. Third, both more efficient and alternative fuel vehicles are critical because transportation accounts for almost 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Electric-powered and hydrogen fuel cell cars are possible replacements, but they make sense from a climate point of view only if the electricity or hydrogen comes from a clean energy source: wind, solar, nuclear. Still, there are serious infrastructure issues associated with fuel cell and electric car deployment that would need to be overcome over the next decade for our transportation emissions to be decreased to the levels that would be required. Again, these are key considerations in the planning for a clean energy future for the mid and long term. So where does this leave us? Looking globally, I would suggest that an agreement in Paris is one step along a path to limiting the most serious impacts of climate change, just as the Clean Power Plan is one step for the United States. But one step is clearly not sufficient. Every country and every state needs to not only meet their 15-year emission targets, but must also put in place programs to assure that we can meet our longer-term goals. A clean energy future is not technically impossible to achieve, but it will disrupt business as usual. We need to anticipate and plan for that future, even as we work to achieve our more immediate goals. Thank you.
Eileen? Oh. Take a question or two? Are there any questions from the audience?
How could that be?
No, that's a photographer. He's just standing. We have some up here. Or Julie, you actually have one right behind you. There you go. We'll just do that. We'll be proficiency and then we'll go here.
My name is Malin Monch. I represent Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. And one thing that I've been curious about in this effort to control and limit greenhouse gases is this concept of baseload power. Germany seems to have engineered its system so that the concept of baseload power is now irrelevant. They do dispatch priority for their renewable sources of energy, and they have, through software engineering and through engineering of their hardware, they now use both their coal plants and even their nuclear plants as the fill-in. And China, as I understand it, has also decided to go down this path of giving dispatch priority to renewables. I'd like to know what your comments are on that.
I mean, it's a big step forward, what Germany is doing and what China may do. But I think you have to look at what is possible over this time period. And I think it is very hard to imagine that we will deal with all of the storage and transmission issues which there still are. I mean, I think Germany at its peak is like 50% renewable and 50% what I would call baseload power. So even if everybody was there, you still have this other chunk of power need, and it's global. There also are people in parts of the world who don't have any power at all. So I think we're going to need baseload power for some significant period of time, even with a good dispatch system, as you point out.
My name is Vijay. Oh, sorry. My name is Vijay Nilekani. I'm a consultant. Just to clarify a question as well, the Germans define burning wood as renewable.
Yes.
And they're importing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wood chips from the US and Canada. And it's a big carbon footprint, and it's less efficient than coal. So it doesn't make sense. Secondly, they rely on nuclear power from France because it's an interconnected grid.
And coal power also.
Right. So
yes.
I think it's a little overstating to say
Yes.
they've resolved all the technical problems. I don't believe that's true at all.
Well, I mean, they are doing a lot in the renewables area. I think the dispatch system is good despite the wood burning. But there is still this need for baseload power. And
Absolutely.
in shutting down nuclear,
Absolutely.
Germany is actually burning more coal.
And they haven't yet shut it all down. So it
No,
would be the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
So where are we, and you can answer we as you prefer, but so where are we on the recognition curve of a role that nuclear energy should play?
Well, let's see. In the U.S., we are unfortunately shutting down some of our existing nuclear, or there are plans to shut it down. There also is some new nuclear under construction, so I think that might sort of balance it out a little bit. I think some of the developments in the new modular systems could become very attractive on a global basis. There certainly are countries that are moving on nuclear globally. I mean, China is actually one of them. I mean, they're doing a lot in renewables, but they're also planning a whole lot of nuclear. South Korea is planning a whole lot of nuclear. So I think it varies as to where it is. I just think it needs to be more explicit. I mean, it's like people don't want to say it, even though some of it is actually happening. And, you know, I think it is part of the solution here. It's not the whole thing, but it's part of it.
And one last question right here.
Seth Bornstein, AP. In terms of, you didn't touch too much on renewables. How crucial is energy storage, battery technology improvements?
Very.
And how far away do you think we are to meet for those?
I mean, there are some interesting new developments in battery storage, which could open things up quite a bit. But figuring it out in the lab and trying it out in small scale and getting it deployed globally doesn't happen overnight. So, I mean, I can conceive of something in like 2050 where we're a lot of renewables, because in fact these things will have come to pass, but we're still going to need some other 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week power. And you know, if you're interested in the climate, you've got to think that nuclear is a better choice than coal or gas.
Well, thank you for the introductions, Jonathan, David, and Eileen. Thank you to NEI for sponsoring today's event. And good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. I think this is a great turnout. I think it will be an interesting discussion. My name is David Unger, and I am the energy editor at the Christian Science Monitor. And we're here today to, as Eileen sort of has dived into, take stock of global climate negotiations less than 1 month before the summit in Paris. As you all know, negotiators across the globe are finalizing an agreement that will shape energy and climate policies once the current Kyoto Protocol runs its course in 2020. And the goal, of course, is to limit greenhouse gas emissions and the warming that those emissions cause to within a generally agreed upon safe range. And I think if decades of global climate talks have taught us anything, it's that is easier said than done. But don't tell that to the person sitting next to me. Our guest this morning is Christiana Figueres. She is the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ms. Figueres came to the position in 2010, and she has the unenviable task of finding common ground among 195 nations that represent the full spectrum of economic development, right, from Ghana to Guatemala to Germany and all across the globe. Before joining the Secretariat, Ms. Figueres served many years as a member of the negotiating team.
Just cut to the chase. We don't have too much time.
Everybody knows
there
her
is
background.
urgency in this room.
Wow.
There is urgency on the climate. Let's just
all
get
right,
to
that's
it.
true. It's the countdown begins. So
Let's do it.
yeah, she's got to catch a flight later today anyway. So
It's not about that. It's about, just let's
All right.
use the time wisely.
great. All right. Well, then in that case, we'll go ahead and jump right in.
Good.
Ms. Figueres will make a few opening remarks.
She won't even do that. Just
Oh,
go.
all right. We'll jump right into the questions then. We're moving
You know
right
what?
along.
I actually thought that I was going to give a little lecture, so I have little notes
Well-
here about a lecture that we are going to kill. And
Right.
I am just here to answer any
Okay.
questions.
Well,
just
in that
go
case,
for it.
Great. Well, then I will start hopefully with a question that I think will give you a chance to talk about some of the things you were hoping to talk about, which is very simple. With a few weeks.
There's nothing simple in climate. What are you talking about?
Point taken. Touche. With just a few weeks left to go before the agreement, are negotiations on track for a successful outcome in Paris?
That depends on how you define successful. If you define successful as assuming that a Paris outcome, a Paris meeting, is actually going to solve climate change, that it is going to be a one-off deal, then no. But I have already been pellucidly clear about the fact that if I get one question in Paris that says, and you didn't get us onto 2 degrees, then I will chop the head off of the person who asked that question. Because I have been saying for at least a year, if not more, that that is impossible. For many of the reasons that Eileen put forward, but many others, you cannot turn an economic development model that we have been using and that some in this world have benefited more from of 150 years and then turn that around in 1 or in fact even in 23 years, which is the years that both Eileen and I have actually grown old in this fight. So what can Paris do? I think that's the more important thing. What can Paris do and what will Paris do? It will do basically 3 things. Number 1, it will construct the receptacle, if you will, we call it a different thing, but doesn't matter, the receptacle to receive 157 national climate change plans that have already been submitted to us, and we will see more, that stem out of the broadest and deepest analysis of what each of those 157 countries can do to contribute either in reducing emissions or in preparing themselves for the negative impact of climate change. 157 national climate change plans that denote the deepest engagement with climate change that we have ever had. So all of those need to be received in some way and have legal standing. Point number 1. Point number 2. We have to be able to admit publicly, privately, and everything in between that those 157 national climate change plans do not constitute enough emission reductions, as Eileen has pointed out, to put us onto the path of 2 degrees. However, what they do is they get us off the business as usual trajectory that we were on just 4 or 5 years ago to a temperature increase of 4 to 5 degrees, and by some estimates, even 6 degrees. We are no longer on that path, assuming full implementation of the climate change plans that we can talk about. So we are now, with those climate change plans, we are on a trajectory to get somewhere by the end of the century, 2.7 or 3 degrees. Is it much better than 4, 5, or 6 degrees? Yes. Is it enough? No. So because it is not enough, that is why the Paris Agreement will not just construct the receptacle for the current short-term efforts, but also draw the arc into the future. And the arc into the future needs to have a destination, a final destination, which is, we call it climate neutrality, i.e., we have to get to the point where we're only emitting as many greenhouse gases as the Earth can naturally absorb. That is where we have to get to. So the final destination needs to be there, and logic would tell you that if you have a starting point and you have a final destination, maybe we should have a journey in between. And that journey needs to be along a transparent, robustly measured, rigorous journey that would be measured. Currently, they're thinking of measuring every 5 years, sufficiency of effort, let's say, to be able to say, okay, we want to get down to under 2 degrees. How are we doing? And how do we increase those efforts? I actually have full confidence that we will be able to get onto this 2-degree pathway for 3 different reasons. A, technology is definitely improving, coming down in cost, coming up in efficiency. And you know, the real story here is solar and wind are just going through the roof. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, is very happy to be corrected because they, in 2007, assumed and predicted that we would only have 20 gigawatts of solar by this year. We now have 180 gigawatts and going through the roof. Completely insufficient, but certainly on the right path. So we will have technology, much more technology available to us. Capital is moving very, very quickly, already shifting $2.6 trillion away from what I call the technologies of last century into this century. 2.6 is a good start, but we have to get to 90 trillion. But getting there. And thirdly, absolutely increasing political will. There is not a single country, there's not a single country that tells me that they don't want a good Paris Agreement, that tells me that they're not looking at this transformation. Folks, this transformation is underway. It is unstoppable. And what we have to do here is ensure that we can increase the pace because it is urgent, and get down to a 2-degree pathway and measure ourselves transparently along the way of progress.
Great. I wanted to follow up on the increasing political will.
Can I steal that water?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have yours over there. Can we grab that? You're going to need it. So the increasing political will, I wanted to get your thoughts on the most recent meeting in Bonn. It seemed like some of the reports coming out of there suggesting that some of those old divides are creeping back into the talks. Did you get that sense? What did you learn from the Bonn talks that you think can be built upon for Paris?
The Bonn talks meeting just last
Right,
week or
yes.
whatever. Well, no surprise. No surprise if you start a session that has 195 countries sitting around the table. And you know that the purpose of any diplomatic negotiation is not to please 1 or 2 or 3, but have to displease all, and to have everybody walk out of the room feeling at least equally comfortable, because nobody's going to be delighted. That's the point of a diplomatic negotiation. That's the unavoidable truth. Well, then it is a very, very understandable that if you walk in with a text that is not perceived as being balanced, that there is going to be a reaction. So benefits of that text that we had last week is it was very clear, it was very concise. It was not comprehensive, it was not balanced. So what did the countries that felt that it wasn't comprehensive and not balanced do? They made it comprehensive and balanced. I mean, that's pretty predictable. Where does that put us in front of Paris? Certainly under pressure, but if you look at that text, if you study it, you can actually see, so I sort of use my personal X-ray eyes looking at a text, and I see the agreement is there. It needs to be tweaked out. It needs to be tweezed out among all 195 countries, but it's definitely still there.
Great. I won't ask you about the 2 degrees Celsius target.
Because
I want to keep my head.
Yes,
is what I want to do.
Exactly. Very good.
But I will ask you about this journey. And I think one thing I've been hearing a lot is this idea of thinking of this agreement as sort of installing a feedback loop, and you mentioned this 5-year sort of potential review process. Just yesterday, I believe France and China came out with an agreement kind of advocating for a 5-year review process. Can you just go into a little bit of the details of that? I mean, how do we, what happens after Paris? How do we get to the end of the journey? And is a 5-year review process critical to that?
It's absolutely fundamental. Because of the reason that those, that current efforts are not enough. And because we as a community of nations, we as humanity are embarked in the most transformational energy revolution that we have ever seen, and it needs to occur within a very, very short period of time. This is not like the Industrial Revolution, where we discovered a fossil fuel, we developed the technology, and then we took off on an Industrial Revolution that the pace of which was actually determined by technology and by the market. That's not the way this can happen, okay? It is going to be equally transformational, but it's got to be intentionally planned and accelerated. So that ramp up mechanism, if you will, is there precisely to do that, to take the progress that we already have, the technological, the political, the capital, all the progress that we already have, but ramp it up very, very quickly. And is it going to be every 5 years? Yes, there are some countries that would even like it, to be more than that. But it is going to include, or it's going to be focused on countries, what countries are doing, because that is the data that we officially get. It will put under its wing the sometimes additional, sometimes covered by effort that corporations are putting in. And I think, that is one piece that we tend to forget. And today, you talked about China and France coming out yesterday, very interesting agreement. Today, WBC, World Business Council for Sustainable Development and PricewaterhouseCoopers come out with a very, very fantastic study that it's not even a study, it's actually already the commitment of 140 companies, all of which are Fortune 500, that are coming together to, over the next 5 to 10 years, be the power behind emission reductions that is going to take us, actually, they think, 65% of the way to 2 degrees. The interesting thing about that is that not only is it investing $5 to $10 trillion into new technology, much more interesting is the fact that it is going to cause 5 to 10 million jobs, direct jobs per year, and 4 times that much in indirect and induced jobs. This is a huge job opportunity. This is about a new way to do business. This is about creating many, many more industries. This is actually, frankly, I am up to here with the doom and gloom news about climate. This is the biggest opportunity and the best news that we have had. This is the mega development project of the world. Let's wake up and take advantage of it before it's too late.
To jump on that private sector thing, at the same time, we also have companies like Volkswagen just came out, again, I think yesterday, saying that this emissions cheating scandal has actually spread to some of their other models. Are you concerned that big scandals like that undermine some of the public's confidence in these
No, I am actually delighted about the Volkswagen, okay? I am delighted because do you know what that has done for Volkswagen? You have to understand, what does Volkswagen mean in German? And I actually speak German, I live in Germany. It means the car of the people, okay? So when Volkswagen says, okay, we screwed up, admit it, they're waiting to see how high the fine is going to be, but what is their corporate strategy? We are going to scrap diesel, and we're moving to electric vehicles. Well, now we have a little revolution underway, right? Because Tesla is certainly opening up very, very new ground, but Tesla, as we all know, is not exactly the people's vehicle.
Sure.
So if the people's vehicle says we're going to electric vehicles and we're going to make it accessible for everybody to be able to get a car, now we have, a little electric transportation here revolution underway. You couple that with BMW saying just 2 months ago, Their last internal combustion engine vehicle is going to be built in 2030 and then no more. You couple that with The Economist just last week, 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, saying, you know what? We're moving not only toward electric vehicles, we're moving toward electric airplanes. Well, my friends, I ask you, is it time to begin to build the museum to the internal combustion engine? Perhaps.
Transitioning into the climate finance question, obviously another big point here. Green Climate Fund's aim is to get to $100 billion in financing by 2020.
No, sorry, let me correct you on that one. The Green Climate Fund is never going to channel $100 billion.
Okay.
Let me take 3 levels of climate finance that are interlinked but are very separable and should be separated. Starting from the little circle. The tiny, weensy little circle is $10.2 billion that have now been capitalized into the Green Climate Fund, not all of which have actually made it. You know, the check is in the mail, and the mail is kind of slow these days. But 10.2 billion that are there really for the purposes of getting many of these countries ready to access much larger volumes of capital for the kind of it's almost like, what should I say, priming the pump, okay? So those 10 billion are there, you know, that's the initial capitalization, and there'll have to be another capitalization. Very important in particular because it is only the Green Climate Fund has actually been able to get a decision that says 50% of the capital is going to go to adaptation, 50% is going to go to mitigation. So very important. I do not want to undermine it. Very important. However, it's not even peanuts. It's the bag that you throw out after you've had your peanuts because it is too tiny. The same thing can be argued about the famous 100 billion, okay? The 100 billion that was promised by developed countries to developing countries in Copenhagen is fine. Somebody pulled it out of their hat and said, how much? 100 billion sounds good, fine. Everybody can write 100 and most people can spell a billion. It makes no impact, okay? It is politically critical to get that 100 billion, and the latest OECD report says that we may be on our way. We have 51 billion in 2013, 62 billion in 2014, assuming certain, you know, methodologies, assumptions, and definitions that haven't been agreed by all. But the point is that, you know, the order of magnitude is an order of magnitude that is beginning to get close to the 100 billion, and those 100 billion are due in 2020. So, you know, we may be on our way. And, sorry, but this is very important. The 100 billion is the tail that wags the dog. And no dog wants to be without a tail, so the tail has to be there. But no tail can be without a dog either. Did I say the other way around? No dog can have a tail, and no tail can have a dog. The 100 billion have to be there because they are politically critical. But let me be very clear. This transformation is not about 10 billion, it's not about 100 billion. This is about trillions. And the new climate economy report has already been very clear. Over the next 15 years, there is going to be no matter what, with Paris, without Paris, with climate change, without climate change. Forget about climate, forget about Paris. There is going to be an investment of $90 trillion that are going to go into infrastructure in the world, most in the developing countries, which is most of the growth is coming, energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure mostly, and urbanization infrastructure, 90 trillion over the next 15 years. The question that needs to be answered is, are those 90 trillion going to go into the technologies of the past, in which case we are majorly screwed, or are they going to go into the technologies of this century? That is the question. It's not about 10 billion.
Well, but as a political symbol, as you mentioned, I mean, are you concerned that there are developing countries saying if the money's not on the table, then, you know, we're not going to be a part of this? I mean, is the developed world, by having only raised 10 billion in commitments at this point, sending a message that they are not going to put the money where their mouth is?
Well, I am confident that, actually, I know that the industrialized countries are working on this. This is definitely homework, work in progress, and I can't tell you how many conversations we're having about this from here to Paris. But yes, they do have to make a very solid showing. And let me explain why. Because it is very, very clear that the concentration of greenhouse gases that we have up there in the atmosphere has been caused by developed countries. That is not ideology, that is simple facts. What developing countries are now saying is, okay, here's the math. Out of the total carbon budget that we have as humanity for the rest of the existence of humanity, however long we may choose to be on this beautiful planet, we have already eaten up 2/3 of the budget. 2/3. So we have 1/3 of the budget left for the rest of humanity, mostly for the developing countries because those are the ones that are coming up, right? So there's a slight problem here. And of course, developing countries need to continue their economic development. They have to bring their population out of poverty. They have to provide at least the very basic of services, if not more. And we're telling them, yes, you can do that, but guess what? You can't do it with the same carbon footprint that the countries of the North did. So of course they're saying, well, if you want us to reinvent what development has always been about in the past 150 years, well, you better help us do that. It is a totally justified argument.
Great. Okay, I have 2 more questions, and then I think we'll open it up because I'm sure you all have plenty of hopefully not head-chopping inducing questions. But I want to close by just expanding a little bit to the broader energy and climate discussion. And I just want to read very quickly a passage from something you said in the New Yorker profile from earlier this year that I thought was interesting. You say, quote, I think this whole climate thing is a very interesting, oh, well, I got the wrong one here. Sorry. That
right. One was actually better.
Well, that one's pretty good too.
I don't know what that is.
No. Well, let me get this first one that I think is interesting first. So you're talking about some oil-rich nations who are perhaps reluctant to be doing emissions reductions, and you're trying to see it from their perspective, and you say, I don't want to put people in a black box and say, you're the culprits, and point a blaming finger. It just helps absolutely nothing. Call it my anthropological training, call it whatever. But I always want to understand what is behind all of this. And so my question based off of that is, has the energy and climate discussion become too polarized, too accusatory? And in what way do we reset that discustion to bring more parties to the table?
I think it has been reset. I think we reached the zenith of, accusatory blaming about 5 or 6 years ago. And I think what is truly transformational about the process that we have been constructing and supporting over the past 5 years is that we have turned the tables around on why are we doing this and how are we doing it. Speak about turning the tables around. It doesn't have to get that dramatic, right? It doesn't have to be that abrupt. That abrupt change is not the one that we want, okay? We want a gradual transformation here. It used to be that we approached this exclusively and predominantly from the global perspective, if you will. Of those of us who still believe that it actually is worthwhile in saving the planet. We're not in the majority around the world, and there was very much of a principle of okay, here is the sum total of emission reductions that need to occur, and then how do we parse that out to the different countries? Well, that didn't turn out very well because there were some countries that signed up for this and then left before they ratified. There were others that signed up, ratified, and then left before they were given a fine. So, that just doesn't work. So the collective wisdom over the past 5 to 6 years is let's turn that around. And let us find where is there a coincidence between the national interest and the global agenda. And let us use the driving force of national interest to actually move the global agenda forward. And that is now the underlying logic of what we're doing in Paris, which has a strength and a weakness. The strength is that these countries are more likely to move forward with the policies and measures that they have put in their climate change plans because it makes sense to them, because they have chosen it, because nobody has put a pistol to their head and said you have to include this or this or that. And they understand that everything that they have put there is because they want to pursue that for their national development, their national security, better health, better transportation, all of the above. Fine. The weakness of that is that the sum total of national interest does not necessarily mean that you've gotten to the global interest or the global need, rather. So to deal with that delta, okay, that is why it is very, very important that Paris not only look at the short term, and we heard it from Eileen also, at the short term climate change plans, but also be able to draw the arc into the medium and the long term.
Excellent. Okay, final question. When you are in Paris, do you have any time to do sightseeing? And if so, what is on the top of your list? Where are you going? Where are you going to go see?
Of course, I'm planning only on doing sightseeing.
Only sightseeing?
Yeah.
The world's counting on you, I think.
Definitely. And it's going to be, I'm going to be seeing the site of Meeting Room A, Meeting Room B, the Plenary 1, Plenary 2.
Well, let's pretend you have...
Bilateral Room C.
All right. Pretend you have an hour free. They give you an hour free. Where would you go? Where could
Well,
you...
the problem is that we're actually going to be working a whole hour outside of Paris.
Oh, okay.
So it would take me a whole hour to just get into Paris.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So sorry.
All righty then. Well, let's open it up for questions. I think Julie's going to run around with the microphone. We have one right here in the aisle up front.
Hi, Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Thanks for doing this. I also don't want to lose my head, but I have a 2-degree question.
Go for it, Lisa. You've been around long enough to know that your head will stay on.
All right. Are you confident that even with this 5-year review and ratcheting up discussions, that mechanism that's being discussed, that will put the world on the path to 2 degrees? There's starting to be some studies saying, there needs to be something more than that, and if there needs to be something more than that, what is it? Also, if you don't mind, if you could comment on the TransCanada decision to ask to suspend its review of the Keystone Pipeline.
Interesting, right? Very interesting.
Would you like to see the Obama administration deny it?
Sorry, what did you say? The last thing?
Would you like to see the administration deny it before Paris?
Oh, well, that is definitely something the United States administration has to decide. Let's just be very, very practical about this and very honest. We simply do not have any other option but to get to under 2 degrees, for many countries 1.5 degrees. There is simply no other option. And the risks of not doing that are so huge, so unmanageable. The human cost is so unpardonable. The economic uncertainty is so completely unpredictable. You have insurance companies today that are already saying a world that goes above 2 degrees is uninsurable. Please contemplate what an uninsurable world means to the global stability of the world, the economic stability, what it means to any of you as individuals here. How do you depend on your insurance? And how many types of insurance do you have to deal with the risks that life gives you? Now multiply that to the planet. Can you imagine a world in which insurance companies would simply not be able to insure you for anything? It is simply a world that we cannot accept. We cannot accept it. And from everything that I can see of the progress in technology, the shift in capital, the increase in political will, all those three, to me, are denoting a transformation that in my book is now by now unstoppable. The direction is pellucidly clear. The only question is the speed. Are we going to get there within the speed that we need? Because the transformation does need to occur within the 5 to 10 to 15 years max in order to avoid the lock-in. So the urgency is truly at our doorstep. It is a question of speed and scale. It is not a question of, are we going to get to 2 degrees? And the cost that we would, we can get, if you can imagine, there are many, many different paths to get to the 2 degrees. If we don't peak in the next, 5 to 10 years, we can still peak later. It's just going to be so much more expensive. So what we're talking about here is speed against cost. And those two things are actually working against each other. The quicker we do it, the cheaper it's going to be. The longer we delay, the more expensive. But even if it is more expensive, we still have to get to the 2 degrees. That's my point. Because we don't have an option. We can't incur what the Financial Stability Board has already determined to be the greatest risk to the economic stability of the world. Just can't do that.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. I don't want.
Seth Bornstein, AP, and 2 questions. First, you looked at the text coming out of Bonn, and you said you see the basis of an agreement there. Is there something that's not in there right now that is sort of what you would think is a minimum requirement for a good agreement out of Paris that's not there now and it needs to be there? Explain to us a little bit more about what it is. And then further, the second question is to continue on your sense of urgency. Can you give us a little bit of timeline on going back to Kyoto in '97? How much has the urgency, the sense of what's happening on the planet changed in the since Kyoto?
What I heard in the plenary of the last session is I heard governments say that they deemed the text to be complete and comprehensive. That is what really counts, right? Honestly, my opinion is pathetically irrelevant here. It is what governments decide. My role is to support them and to ensure that the sum total of efforts are actually responding to the atmosphere and responding to environmental integrity. I actually do agree with governments that all the components are there, whether they are as sharply defined and as clearly delineated and as integrated as they need to be is a very different issue. Because all of these, different issues that are on the table for negotiation, while they're negotiated in quasi-silos of each other, they all are interlinked. So both the clear delineation, the specificity, and the interconnectedness of all of the issues still to be done.
Right behind, right there, Truth.
What was your second question?
About how the urgency.
KP, I think the urgency, it has become much more, people have become much more aware, in part because there is currently no country, not a single country, of the 195, there is not a single country that has not already felt the negative impacts of climate change, one way or the other. Just the analysis, the economic analysis, the financial analysis, the impact analysis are just so much clearer now. So yes, I think the urgency is much clearer now than it used to be.
Dean Scott, Bloomberg BNA here in Washington. I wondered, Christiana, could you talk a little bit about this gap to get ultimately to this 2 degrees, the relevance or importance of the decarbonization goal, whether that's climate neutral, net zero, whatever we wind up in, particularly for energy markets, to send the signal that there's this plan ultimately to get down to 2 degrees, and that analysts and investors should take that seriously, not just be content sort of with the ramp-up mechanism as a way to make it stronger.
I definitely agree, and as I said in the beginning, there's 3 components here. There's a starting line where we are with the INDCs. there is the final destination, and then there is the journey in between. And all three need to be brought together as a coherent whole. And I think there is growing recognition of this. And when I look at the text and I hear the discussion that is going on, what even just a year ago seemed illusory, that countries would be recognizing the need to restore this ecological balance. Just even a year ago, it seemed very illusory. And we have a sizable number of the INDCs that already have that. We have quite a few of the climate change plans that have 2050 goals. And we have, perhaps even more importantly, we have an increasing number of corporations that are either climate neutral now already, or that have short-term, medium-term plans to become climate neutral, because they can all understand that it is also in their interest. So, something that seemed completely impossible before is now beginning to show itself as not just being possible, but actually necessary.
All right, I think we have time for two more quick ones. So how about over here, and then here in the aisle?
Hi, I'm Bill Lovelace, a columnist with USA Today. Mr. Figueres, how strong is the U.S. position now, the Obama administration's position? How strong will it be in Paris, given the continued opposition to it in Congress?
The U.S. administration should be something that Eileen actually answers rather than I. But the U.S. Government will obviously always be a key player, and was a key player during the first administration. But I think it is, very, very evident to everyone that in his second term, President Obama has felt much more free, much more liberty to begin to be much more specific about his vision of the U.S. leadership in this. And what is very interesting to me is to see how this is very, very much in relationship to the transformation that is happening, not at the same time, but actually before the U.S. in China. And the fact that China has taken an undisputed leadership, okay? You have to understand that China is today the #1 producer, installer, and exporter of solar technology, #2 in wind. And they plan on continuing that. They are having remarkable targets. Who would have been able to tell us that China would be able to accept, or in fact even propose, a peaking of coal by 2020, that they would be closing coal plants all around the cities because Chinese citizens would like to breathe the air that they don't look at. And yes, health is very important, but also China is very much understanding that their competitiveness into the future can no longer rely on low wages. It's going to have to rely on low carbon. That is a dramatic shift, because competitiveness in the future is about low carbon services and goods, and China wants to be there. So when you have the president of the Central Bank of China saying that his mandate is to accelerate green finance in China, that's a very different situation from what we had just 1 or 2 years ago. When you have Chinese leadership saying that they want to be the leaders of the eco-civilization. So that has politically opened up a lot of space for the United States, but perhaps more importantly, it has also challenged the United States, I would say, because does US industry want to give up all the leadership of the future to other countries? Or does US industry want to partake of the new economy that we're actually already moving into? And I think the number of companies that have joined and have an increasing number of companies coming forward and showing support for the clean power here in the United States, the increasing number of states, California anyway, way beyond anything else. But you see that there is an increasing realization that this is about competitiveness. You can say what you want about the science. Let's just talk numbers, right? Let's talk job creation. Let's talk economic growth. That is where it is. In the United States today, there are 10 times as many patent filings for renewable technologies than there are for fossil fuel. Well, that already tells you where the economy is moving and where jobs are going to come and where competitiveness is going to come. So the United States is actually playing catch up to China.
Does congressional opposition matter, though? That's big. I mean, Congress, the House is, acting on it even as we speak.
Yeah, fine.
I think we have time for this one very quick last question. Right here in the middle. Very quickly, we're very short on time, so.
Chris Hawley from the Energy Daily. Thanks again for doing this. Ms. Figueres, your statements about the 5-year interval, does that mean you're very confident that that provision will be part of a final treaty, or is there significant opposition remaining from any country or groups of countries?
No, I'm very confident that it's going to be part of it. I think the discussion right now is the periodicity. Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 10? And most countries are moving toward 5 for very evident reasons, just because it keeps a faster pace. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that that will be there.
Ms. Figueres, thank you so much for joining us
That's
today.
it?
That's
That was easy.
That was quick. Yeah.